friends, have a lot of friends, a lot of former friends, I'm afraid, but a lot of friends in the administration and senior reaches. And I said, reach out to China. And you know what? The order came from the White House, no discussions with China during the first year because we're reassessing. Biden came out swinging when they had that first meeting in Anchorage, Alaska. It was like, nice to meet you. What about Hong Kong? What about Xinjiang? What about Taiwan? In other words, put the thumb in the eye of the other side publicly and aggressively from the start. What's Nancy Pelosi doing flying to Taiwan? Don't provoke. If you know the history, don't provoke. Talk, discuss, debate, disagree, negotiate. All of that's fine. But why we're provoking is something I find irresponsible and really dangerous and unnecessary. And we will walk into a war the way we're going, just like we did with Ukraine. And our diplomats told us the war with Ukraine is going to come if we continue on the path that we're going. And I'm telling you, if we continue on the path that we're going in our rhetoric in Taiwan and the arming of Taiwan and all the rest, it's no favor to Taiwan. All we're doing is taking steps towards a complete breakdown of trust that will lead to disaster if we don't understand how to avoid that.
So what do you make of what happened with Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the Chinese brokering that peace?
The Chinese have a growing reach in the world because they're the lead trade partner of probably half the world at this point. And they buy a lot of oil from the Middle East. They have good relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they really don't want war. They don't want war in Taiwan. They don't want war in East Asia. They don't want war in Ukraine, by the way. And I know it. And I had long discussions in Beijing a couple of months ago about the Ukraine war. They don't want this instability. What they want is to continue to have economic development. And so I think that their foreign policy is pretty darn serious, which is it is based on economics. It's based on what we used to do, and we did it a lot, and we did it to good effect, which was helping to build infrastructure, helping American businesses to have a positive role in places to be a base for economic development. Well, China's doing that exactly right now. And we view that as, oh my God, look at how horrible. But it's not horrible. It's just smart. You know, they've grown. They are major trade partners. So they're doing things that are to their benefit, but not to the disadvantage of the other countries. They believe actually that the cooperation and win-win makes a lot of sense for them. And I think they're being proved right because most of the world is not falling into line with the United States right now. Most of the world is looking at, say, the Ukraine war and saying, why don't you negotiate this? And why is NATO enlargement so vital when Russia said don't do it? And most of the world's looking at the Taiwan issue and saying, you know, maybe calm down. Don't just have an arms race there. And so I think the Chinese are very successful diplomatically, except in what we call the Western world, which, by the way, is now, you can define it pretty precisely. It's the US, Canada, UK, European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. That's the part that's on side on Ukraine. That's the part that the US gets into line on all of these issues. But you know what? The population of that group is probably about 12 to 15% of the world population. And the rest of the world's looking on and saying, we're not quite in line with that. And we tell ourselves, oh, we're leading the world, but not really. What we're leading is a pretty small part of the world population that doesn't buy into expanded military alliances and so forth, that basically wants economic development. So competing on economic development, great. Competing on who can help different region of the world to develop or to have green energy, great. But let's do that. That's a race to the top, not a race to a new nuclear arms race and so forth. And we keep saying, look, China's building up its military. We are 3 times the military spending of China. So if we're concerned about that, let's sit down and negotiate so that we don't have an arms race between the two. China doesn't want an arms race. China wants economic development.
How about, you didn't talk about in that kind of litany of the countries describing our cohort, you didn't talk about where Latin America, traditionally Latin America was in the American sphere of influence. Is that changing too?
Yeah, President Lula is, first of all, quite outspoken, saying we need a negotiated peace in Ukraine. And he, of course, was recently in China, and he said it in China, and our press reported, how dare he say these things? And how dare he talk about NATO expansion as being provocative and so forth? But this is the Latin American view. And I was with another president of a major Latin American country a few months ago. I won't put that person on the spot. But the first words when we sat down was from the president, this is about NATO. What is this enlargement thing? Why is this being pushed so much? That's again from I didn't provoke it. That's what the president said to me first thing. That is a widespread view. And remember, we've not exactly been helpful in the Latin American context in recent years. There was an active attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan president, not even subtle. I mean, it was admitted, acknowledged. At one point, Trump, in what I regarded as almost a comic book approach, except it's tragic, just said, okay, Maduro's no longer president. Now Juan Guaido is president. We picked a president. We just said, no, we're going to call that one president, not this one president. We put on sanctions to break the Venezuelan economy, which our sanctions actually did. And I was in the Americas quite often during this period, and the presidents were saying to me, you're breaking the region. You're dividing the region in two. We can't cooperate. Of course, we have to go along with the White House. They can squeeze the hell out of us. They can stop us from getting loans from the Inter-American Development Bank or from the Latin American Development Fund. So we go along, but we can't even talk to our neighbor because they're on the other side of this thing. So this is really a strong feeling. It's crazy. It's so unnecessary. We shouldn't declare that someone else is president than the actual president of a country. It's a bad habit. It's a kind of arrogance that never works out. And on all of these things, I have to say, just watching them for so many years and so many decades, when we froze the accounts of Venezuela, said, you can't have your own money anymore. And then we said, Maduro is no longer president, Guaido is president. And by the way, then some Harvard economists and some MIT economists said, yeah, now we're going to help the new administration of Guaido. I thought, this is ridiculous. This absolutely is going to end bad. And of course, it ended almost like a farce, except for Venezuela, which has been devastated economically. But Maduro is there. Now we run to him to say, you got to pump more oil to replace the Russian oil that we're taking off the market, because they're not thinking. And the main point is, John, stop being so arrogant in this U.S., because this is where you keep stepping into problems, thinking you can do whatever you want, even when the other country is saying, please don't do that. Just give us some space, or don't overthrow us, or don't seize our assets. But there's an arrogance that really is bad. I went back, by the way, and read a book that I vaguely remembered from high school. And I read it last weekend. It's almost 60 years old. J. William Fulbright, The Arrogance of Power.
I remember that.
Unbelievable. I remembered it too. And for more than a half a century, I hadn't looked at it. And I went back and I read it this weekend, and you could read it as if it was talking about today. And basically, Fulbright, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and of course, where the Fulbright scholarships came from, originated, was saying we keep getting into trouble because we can't listen to the other side. And he has a whole riff about how good neutrality can be, and that sometimes you don't want to push NATO or you don't want to push your side. It's actually literally there in the 1960s saying if we would let some of these countries be neutral, the Soviet Union would go home, we would go home, and we'd leave these countries in the middle in peace. And he cites Austria, which I've come to know this year very well because I've been spending some of my sabbatical there. In 1955, Austria declared neutrality. The Soviet Union, which had occupied part of Austria after World War II, sent the troops home, and Austria became a neutral, incredibly successful, peaceful country, never bothered again at all by the Soviet Union because it was neutral. And that was a model. That's the model for Ukraine, by the way. That's the model that George Kennan kept saying. Give some space so that we're not putting our nose right up against the other guy, not provoking. And it's a model that we don't learn because you have to tone down the arrogance a little bit to learn to give some space. So I think it comes back over and over again to that.